and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland's The Full Scottish. In a week that's been all about expectations, things that we've been expecting to happen, things that we're still waiting to happen, and others which who knows if they're ever going to happen. In the former category is the start of the impeachment process of Donald Trump, long awaited, and we'll be considering what, if anything, will happen. And if you've been watching the tragic unfolding of events in Hong Kong, the again fairly expected imposition of what protesters are calling de facto martial law. But the greatest expectation of all remains the vote of no confidence. Will they? Won't they? What on earth is going to happen? So to discuss all these things, some of these things and other things, my guests this morning are Professor Kirstein Rummery from Stirling University, Scottish spokesperson of the Women's Equality Party and disability campaigner, and Broadcasting Scotland's very own Kenny McBride. Kenny, we have to stop meeting like this on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, well.
Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Want to start then internationally with the impeachment process of Donald Trump. The fourth president to face impeachment charges in America's history. None of them have ever been kicked out of power. What do you think is going to happen this time, Kenny?
Well, I'm fairly confident that he won't be removed from office. Unless the Republican Party has a sudden change of heart and they decide that they're more likely to win an election with Mike Pence in charge, which seems to me highly unlikely, then I just can't see it. Which it's a real problem, I think, for the American system, in that the only way to address corruption of the president is by what is essentially a political process. Mm-hmm. In an ideal world, we would have, or they would have, I guess, kind of honourable senators who did the right thing regardless of partisan affiliation, but that's just not how American politics works now, if it ever did. The divisions are so stark that the likelihood of a Republican Senate doing anything about this is slim to none.
Plus it's a 2/3 majority is the sticking point. Andrew Thompson in 1867 did get voted against, but not by a 2/3 majority, so he wasn't removed from power. And Clinton, they didn't vote against him. So I think it's unlikely. One Republican senator has kind of said they might.
Mitt Romney has come forward and said that he's looking in that direction. He's one of the few who has really been against Trump from the beginning. And it's kind of surprising. There were several Republicans, obviously, during the nomination process who were vehemently anti-Trump. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and these people. I mean, Marco Rubio in particular was quite forward-thinking on immigration, especially. And but then as soon as Trump got the nomination, they all just dutifully fell in behind him and supported the wall.
So actually, Kirstein, do you agree that this is a political issue? It's not actually about justice. Is it just about trying to make things more uncomfortable for the Republicans given that there's an election next year?
I think in all of the impeachment cases there was a political element to them, and this is no different. But what is clear from the way this one is playing out is that Trump's brand of populism, that he's playing to his core voters as well as his core party, is very, very carefully crafted and is carrying on through this whole process. And he looks to the ordinary American voter like somebody who the big guys are ganging up on, and he's absolutely fine. And he's not actually interested in the legal justice side of it. He's not even interested in the truth, whatever that is. He's solely interested in the gamesmanship and how it plays out. And in terms of that, the fact that the Republicans have, come into line behind him, and they always would, I think, given that his popularity on the ground with his core fan base is still incredibly strong, but also how it's playing out domestically, it makes him look exactly in the position that he wants to be, that he can carry on saying outrageous things and it doesn't matter because he's the victim of a conspiracy. He's a victim of the swamp in Washington. He's a victim of all this political conspiracies. When actually, I mean, those of us who've been following it know there is quite a case to be answered here. But it's that's not really the issue.
It is against the law. It is against United States law for any sitting president to ask for any involvement from any foreign power, and not just the Ukraine and Russia, but there's even suggestions now that he's asked Boris Johnson to give advice and help, and Italy and Australia. So there's enough case law there. It does seem unbelievable. And China, most recent, does seem ridiculous in a way that nothing can be done about that.
Well, I mean, there's more than that. There are multiple counts of potential breaches of the Emoluments Clause, which is where you get personal enrichment from political office, because he's been having foreign leaders stay in his hotels. He's been having soldiers visiting Turnberry when planes have been getting refuelled at Prestwick for no very obvious reason. There are dozens of things that he has done that there is at least a strong case that he's broken the law.
For the American Constitution, if this is the fourth attempt to impeach a president and it just doesn't work, it doesn't have any effect, doesn't even necessarily seem to affect someone's popularity. I mean, obviously Nixon resigned before they could press the charges. He's not going to resign. So what on earth are the American people going to do about a president who just thinks it's fair enough to make the rules up as he goes along?
I mean, they hopefully vote him out next November. Other than that, I mean, is the one benefit of the American system is that there are term limits, and that no matter how bad you are, the longest you can ever be in office is 8 years. Obviously, you can do a tremendous amount of damage in 8 years, but it's unlikely, I think, that he could so fundamentally change the system that he could kind of do any really long-lasting damage.
No, I disagree. I think the long-lasting damage has been done. So sticking then with world leaders who think it's fine to break the law or thumb their noses at the law, let's turn then to the most recent development in the Boris Johnson saga of his fight with the courts. So the Court of Session in Scotland are about to make a ruling on what will happen to him if he decides not to comply with the Benn Act, and that has now forced Number 10's hand to say that he will comply with the Benn Act after all. Now, do you think he will, first of all, or do you think he's running circles round us? And is this going to have an effect perhaps on the vote of no confidence? Because that was all predicated around we couldn't have one until the letter of extension was asked for. He's now said he'll write that letter of extension. So what do you think is his gameplay in this? Kirsten.
Well, I was going to say, gameplay is absolutely the word here. I mean, I remember learning constitutional law as an undergraduate, and it was the most boring thing, and nobody ever wanted to turn up to it. Now suddenly everybody's a constitutional expert in the UK, or at least frantically trying to become one. And actually, in contrast to what we were talking about before, the way in which the law has been used, and constitutional law has been used, not just politically, but also legally in all of this, has been absolutely fascinating. But coming back to it, yes, Boris Johnson is a populist leader. He's a game player, in exactly the same way as Trump is. Whether the allegations from his sister are correct and that he's absolutely going for a no-deal crash out in order to make his friends awful lots of money, that may well be the case, but that's not the only thing that is driving him. He's looking at the snap general election that is going to happen. So he's looking at how this all looks and how it all plays out. And if it looks like his ability to deliver on the democratic mandate of a Brexit is being thwarted again by these elite politicians, by these elite lawyers, by all of these people who are standing against the common man, the 17.6 million who voted to leave, then that is what his gameplay actually is. So how it looks is actually way more important than what actually happens in this case, I think.
He announced recently, in fact, just after the defeat in the Supreme Court in London, that he thought it was time for a major constitutional look at the Supreme Court in the UK. And he is openly now advocating, as others have done before, that we move to a US system where Supreme Court judges are made by political appointment. What do you think the fallout with that would be if that was to be suggested? What do you think people would feel about that?
I don't think that would run. I really do not think that would run, because the separation of the judiciary and politics in the UK constitution is so much more stark than it ever has been able to be within the US constitution.
Well, it would certainly be hypocritical, because he was complaining about the fact that the courts were being political in ruling against him. But if he wins the next election, and we might talk about that a little later in the programme, and he has a big enough majority, then, who's going to stop him?
If he wins the next election, he's going to have the problems of Brexit, and he's probably going to have what we're going to come on to talk about later, which is the continuing agitation for independence in Scotland. And he'll be looking to use whatever legislative mechanisms are there for him. But I think, and this is where I do come back to, I've never been a fan of our unwritten, flexible constitution in terms of protecting the individuals from the power of the state. But here it would actually be incredibly useful, because he'd have to go through so many hoops to change that, and there would be so many ways, again, it comes back to game playing. There'd be so many ways to stop him that he is a strategic game player. He would be thinking very carefully about whether this was worth his while in terms of all the other things that he would want to achieve in power.
But he's not the first he's not the first Conservative politician to suggest it. It has been suggested before, and I suspect it's something that's going to keep coming back, to be honest. So let's then just leave allegedly illegal world leaders to the side for the moment, and you talked about the push for independence. So obviously yesterday in Edinburgh there was a pretty clear physical manifestation of that desire. I think certainly the biggest all under one banner march, and probably as big if not bigger than the Stop the War Coalition march that happened in Edinburgh. What are we going to have to do to persuade Westminster that there is a growing clamour for another referendum and for independence, especially when the polls are not really showing the sort of gap that anecdotally we're all aware of ourselves from people we know who've changed their mind? So what do we need to do, Kenny?
I don't think the problem is convincing Westminster that the desire is there. I don't think that's ever been the problem. I think we keep hearing this argument that, we need to get to 60% in the polls and, get that consistently, and that'll prove that it's real. And I mean, first of all, we're never going to get 60% consistently in the polls before there's a vote. It won't happen. And besides, there are probably 40% of Scots who will never vote for independence under any circumstances. So you'd be looking at effectively having every possible convertee converted before we even announced a vote. The problem is not, I think, that Westminster thinks, why waste time on a vote that's going to go the same way? Their thing is, why allow a vote that's going to go the way we don't want it to? And I don't know that increasing our support in the polls is actually going to help with that.
But at least it then stops the argument that there's no desire for this, and we can shout back, oh yes there is, and it just becomes pantomime, and that's not leading us anywhere. So it's proving. I mean, it's interesting that certainly on News at 10 last night the march wasn't covered at all. So if you didn't watch any evening news, there was a bit of a mention, I think, on the sort of early evening news, and you're living in the rest of the UK, you didn't know what happened. And obviously England is considerably larger, public opinion in England is important in this matter, and it's all being filtered, so they're not aware of it. So I'm sure you probably did, as I did, on social media, let English friends know that this had been happening, just in case they believed that there was no interest in independence. But I mean, the game is changing even more than having to prove we've got an interest. There's been suggestions from the Lib Dems before they decided just to rip up Article 50 should they ever get into power. Unlikely, clearly, that there should always be a confirmatory referendum on any other major referendum. So that was obviously, I think, aimed at us. So let's say we have a referendum, we vote to leave the UK, and then when the deal is understood, we have a confirmatory referendum. I don't actually have a problem with that. I think that's absolutely fine. But now the other insidious suggestion is that we would need a 2/3 majority. And it's back to 1979 with the 40% rule, which is what stopped devolution in the first place. They haven't imposed that on any other referendum. That would be manifestly unfair. But that's, to me, feels like the direction of travel. And I'm not convinced we've got an answer to any of that or a strategy for it. And that really worries me.
I think the strategy has to be incredibly carefully thought out. And there are several stages to the strategy. There's a strategy to get a referendum, and then there's a strategy for what happens during the negotiating period, because we've seen that actually is going to be incredibly key to whether or not, even if we won an independence referendum, whether it would be delivered and on what terms it would be delivered. And of course, the incredibly important thing there, as you say, 40%, I would say probably a little bit less than that, but there's a stalwart unionist movement who are the equivalent of the Remainers, who would be no matter what. We've seen that, you can stall Brexit for an awful long time. We'd be stalling independence for an awful long time. So some of the strategizing could be, ask for a Section 30 mandate and then get turned down. And then suddenly you have the moral high ground because there's no reason to deny a Section 30 vote. All sorts of things could be happening. But the crucial thing is, and I think all of the independence movement have to think about this, not just the political movers and shakers, is how, if we were granted an independence referendum, we would actually get everybody on side, or the people on side, to actually deliver that. Because we've seen the damage that Brexit has done. It hasn't even happened yet, and it's done huge economic and social political damage to the country. It's not likely to go well even if we do have a deal, etc., and we need to learn those lessons incredibly carefully in Scotland. But the other thing, of course, is that we went, 17% were in favour of independence prior to the
that was a bit higher,
referendum.
But it wasn't anything like the final figure.
Consistently saying, that they were absolutely. Went from that to 45. So even if the starting point is 48% or whatever it is, what's absolutely clear is there is a huge, we saw in the All Under One Banner March, there is a huge grassroots movement with boots on the ground on the nationalist side, on the independent side, that are willing to do the canvassing, that are willing to do the persuading.
Indeed,
and I'm not at all convinced that happens.
That's the thing.
And that's the starting thing. And I'm not convinced, and I think this is the thing that Westminster will be thinking as well, that the unionist boots on the ground are not there at all. So they are probably going to play a delaying tactic as long as possible until all of this settles down and we return to politics as normal, which is whereby the 40% are actually deciding for the rest of Scotland what's actually happening.
Well, no doubt they'll bust them in. I think the real message from yesterday was, irrespective of the numbers, it was a peaceful demonstration, a peaceful march. It was done in good humour, despite the bad weather, no trouble and no arrests. And for a crowd that size to march, that's fantastic. And that's why I'm disappointed it doesn't get coverage in the mainstream UK media. It's not so much about saying we want independence. I think most people in England have kind of got there's a movement going. It's this is the difference. If that was a march of 200,000 English nationalists, it would have had a different tone altogether, I suggest. And that's disappointing. Keeping with disappointments for a while, the biggest people who were disappointed this week were the Waspi women, when their appeal and the judicial review was turned down by the courts in London. I'm not sure it was ever going to pass, to be honest. I don't think, although I personally feel their case is very strong, I don't think the case they made was tremendously strong. But what next for the Waspi women, Kirsten?
They do seem to have hit a really quite significant wall with this, because they were pinning, and this was about as organised as they could be around it. They did make, they had an awful lot of people on their side. But like you, I wasn't convinced that this was the argument that was going to make it. And also some of the underlying tensions around the arguments. It's not necessarily just the legal arguments, but what they represent in people's minds. This sense of injustice on the group of a group of women who were not given adequate time to make compensation for the fact that they were going to lose an awful lot of their pension rights. at the same time as other tensions, other policy tensions. We're all aware of the ageing population. We're all aware of the low level of pensions anyway. We're all aware of the low level of investment in health and social care and all of these things that are affecting older people. So all of these pushes that are happening to actually equalise the pension age, and probably we'll all be working till we're 80 and drop just to pay for what we've already got.
Said 75 by the time 2035 comes round.
And that's grand for us academics who are sitting around gassing, but it's not fine for firefighters and people in manual jobs. But it's what is really, really unfair is that they've probably run out of legal arguments as well. And they will get an awful lot of support, but as I said, both the political and the legal weight is against them at the moment.
But they're not asking that women's pension age, well, there is the return to 60 group, but generally the argument isn't the women's pension age returns to 60, it's that this particular group of women, and they were asking for a transition pension. Kenny, do you think it's unfair?
I have mixed feelings. Historically, you had obviously a later pension age for men, and yet at the same time you have lower life expectancy for men, and you have men tending to work in dirty, difficult, dangerous jobs. And that creates a different kind of imbalance. Men tended to do things like firefighting. I mean, women only became firefighters relatively recently. So jobs like that require a lot of physical effort. You have men who, you get to 65, you can't do those jobs the way you could when
and
you
the argument
when
is to reduce everybody's to 60, not increase the women.
Sure. But
and also women are doing jobs like social care and nursing, which are equally hard.
But why were women allowed to retire early? It wasn't because they were soft and gentle and didn't do the hard jobs. It's because, for most of them, their pension pot was always going to be much smaller because they had breaks in their pension contributions because they were carers and they looked after children, and therefore they got their pension for longer, and that was to try and make it a bit more equal. The whole point of this legislation was supposedly to make equality. They've actually discriminated against a group of women, and I was checking the figures. The government have saved 5.1 billion every year. It's quite clear what this is about. It's a nonsense to suggest it was trying to make it equal. It's all about putting money back in the coffers.
Yes.
And these women have been held to account. And that is manifestly unfair, Kenny, surely.
It's not great for those women. I agree. I think it makes sense to move towards an equal pension age. I don't think it makes sense to have a different pension age just based on gender.
No,
that doesn't make a lot of sense. What I do think is that this should have been done in a very different way. I think, as you say, women's careers take a different path often because there are breaks for raising children and things, and there's lower pay issues as well.
But more than issues.
No.
But there's also the underlying assumption in work and in pensions that they're also relying on their husband's pension, and therefore theirs doesn't matter as much.
I think one of the things that should be done, just as a matter of course, is that you should have national insurance contributions credited for years when you're at home with kids.
Absolutely.
I mean, that should be
and caring for older people
and
relatives.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that kind of thing that doesn't get credited because we don't consider it work, and that's a problem that I think feeds into this issue.
What do you think about universal basic income then?
I'm 110% in support of universal basic income.
Okay, and yet there is research that suggests it will actually disadvantage women as well. Now, it's not conclusive, but there are concerns. The women's movement is not 100% behind it. It's not been proven yet. There are concerns.
I think it's there. I mean, there are multiple benefits for UBI that I would be 100% behind. Not least because for me, I have some issues that make it difficult for me to work full time. I have some physical problems that I have, and it would be great for me to be able to. It would be great for me to be able to work when I can and not have to risk my benefits in order to do that. You know, I can come in here for a couple of hours and present a show. I couldn't sit in an office for 8 hours a day. I just physically can't do that. So yeah, I would be hugely in support of UBI, and I think that would help to. It starts to recognise that there are things that people do that are valuable that are not paid employment.
To bring it back to
yeah.
the Waspi thing, and it's a very interesting link you've drawn there, Maggie, between UBI and the Waspi pension thing. What happens an awful lot in policy terms is when we tinker with things to try and deal with gender inequalities that are really quite embedded structurally in society, in the system, into our political things, like the thing that you've just raised, we do not recognise caring work as work. An awful lot of the arguments the Waspi women were saying was that we have to retire at 60, we've got grandchildren to look after, we've got elderly parents to look after. Indeed. Who's going to do it if we don't do it? And we absolutely know that. 6 million carers in the country, and if we took those away, the entire social care system would absolutely
billions and billions
fall apart. We are absolutely relying on the work of these women without compensating them for it,
that's
which
all
is
they're
the
asking
deep
for,
unfairness
is a
of
compensatory
it.
transitional pension. The women have lost, on average, £47,000 each. Imagine if that was going back into the economy by being spent, rather than sitting in the government coffers so they can let their rich pals have some
Exactly,
tax
and we
cuts.
know that if you give money directly to women, it gets spent in local economies,
Exactly.
it regenerates poor areas,
Exactly.
all of the things, arguments for that. And going back to the universal basic income, yes, it's absolutely brilliant. It does recognise that there's all sorts of work that we do, but it doesn't compensate for the fact that women are still doing an awful lot of the caring work and will have less of access to the paid work without that fundamental structural realignment. So, I mean, like Kenny, I'm in favour of universal basic income on principle, but the way in which you work it out, it wouldn't address those kind of inequalities, and it wouldn't address the Waspi women's issues either.
And I don't see any real shift coming in the UK on this. I mean, the only hope of any of this happening, obviously, is if we do get independence, because I don't think these arguments that we've just had around this table have any weight or cognizance with the government at all, in really in any party.
And the deeply depressing thing is it should. If you look at our ageing population and you're looking at the way in which gender pay inequality is actually growing, you look at the way in which, with Brexit, we've got social care and nursing is leaving the country. The whole statutory system is going to come crashing to its knees. We're going to go back to relying on women's unpaid labour, much more so than we were, which means gender equality is going to grow. All of these things, and also income inequality across the ages, so older people are going to get poorer and sicker for longer. All of these things should be what the UK government is talking about right now, rather than how we can crash out of the EU and make our friends an awful lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another issue that really affects women, and that is abortion. But in particular, what I'm wanting to pick up is the extremely alarming position of Stella Creasy, who has been targeted by anti-abortionist groups in an extreme manner to the point that the police are really concerned. So there's two issues. One, why does the anti-abortion movement believe they have the right to threaten violence on the life of someone when they're supposedly all about pro-life? That kind of confuses me. And secondly, what does it say about this country that now the way to argue with politicians is to threaten them or kill them if you take it to the extreme? So we've had all this ramped up rhetoric about what people were going to do to the Supreme Court judges. We have the Prime Minister turning around to a woman who stands up in the House and says, I am worried for my safety, and dismisses it as humbug. And now we have the Stella Creasy issue. What on earth is happening in this country? Kenny?
Well, obviously a lot of what has happened to Stella Creasy is utterly unacceptable, and I'm probably about to lose a great deal of my progressive credibility, but I'm pro-life, and always have been. My mum is also extremely pro-life. She's very religious, and she spoils her ballot at every election because there is nobody that she can vote for. All the parties other than the Tories are explicitly pro-choice. The Tories allow you to be pro-life, but they're not actually a pro-life party.
Yes, but neither you or your mother are advocating violence against someone.
No, but my point is that if there is no way that you can express that opinion politically, then it becomes a lot more difficult to do things through traditional political channels. That doesn't justify, I'm not in any sense saying that justifies violence or threats of violence or
intimidating women if they're walking towards abortion clinics.
That kind of stuff is incredibly counterproductive. I have a friend who's involved in pro-life movement in America, and she constantly says, stop using these graphic images. They are not useful. And
interesting you mentioned America, because Kirsten, I think a lot of this rhetoric has been imported from the United States. So this kind of graphic, aggressive, pro-life, led obviously by the fundamentalist church in America, and it's not something we really saw in this country. It's back on the agenda. John Mason has once again leapt into the fray and made a comment. And my objection to him is whether I don't personally care about the man's opinion himself, and we know that he's got a strong faith, but he's an elected representative, and his job is not to use his strong faith to dictate to his constituents, unless he can prove there is a move and a support for his point of view in the constituency. Conversation I've had with John Mason many a time. But that's one thing, but this kind of aggressive, almost a sense of right, is outrageous, and it doesn't feel to me that there's enough being done to protect women who are on the other side of the debate.
I would link this very much to a general sense of violence in politics and the ongoing sense of violence against women in politics. Violence against women in any public arena. You only have to announce that you're a feminist on Twitter to get death threats. And that's always sort of been the case, but certainly with this rise of populism, and I think you're right to link it to some of the ideas that are coming, the populist ideas that are coming in from the USA. I mean, in the Women's Equality Party, which is obviously a pro-abortion, pro-choice party, we had a very difficult discussion. It was one of the most difficult policy things that we covered, because not all women are necessarily in favour of that. But what we came down to, and what most feminists will say, is that this is a health issue. This is about women's bodily autonomy. Nobody's trying to force anybody else to have an abortion. Nobody's trying to, impose, if you decide for religious reasons or whatever, that it's not for you, that's absolutely fine. But that choice and that control over your own body needs to be available to all women, regardless of the circumstances.
Yes, and that's a strong point, Kirsten. I think it's important people realise that people who believe that abortion should be available are not pro-abortion.
No, we're not.
They're pro-choice.
We're not at all.
So this pro-life is, to my mind, part of the issue, the use of that phrase, because really it should be anti-choice. It's anti-choice and pro-choice, because that's what they're saying, is we're going to remove the choice from you, we're going to remove the ability from you.
Well, that depends. I mean, the way that a pro-choice person, a pro-life person would frame that is, we believe that child is alive. And therefore, you saying you're pro-choice is just disguising the fact that you want women to have the right to kill another living person.
Yes, but in UK law, the fetus has no rights.
I appreciate that's the law, but that's not necessarily what people who are pro-life believe. So the framing of the words is.
So it's all right to defend the life of an unborn child, but it's perfectly acceptable to threaten violence, including.
No.
Can I just say that violence?
The whole thing.
Sorry. Violence is not just the threats and the people standing outside abortion clinics throwing things and really quite graphic images and upsetting things. The threats to Stella Creasy, who is pregnant, and in so many ways that is just so deeply wrong, that a woman who's giving up her time, her commitment to serve her country in this way is being targeted like this. Violence is also forcing a woman to carry a pregnancy to term that she really, really doesn't want and really can't cope with. Nobody has an abortion lightly. And all of those sorts of things are all getting kind of conflicted. But what we are seeing, I just want to bring it back to this idea of targeting people and the violence in the targeting, because we're not just seeing it in abortion. As you pointed out, we're seeing it both to Brexiters and Leavers, but much more so to the High Court judges. But we see it disproportionately to women. You only have to look at, and it's racist as well, the undertones, you only have to look at what Diane Abbott has to put up with. You only have to look at Jo Cox, the only political assassination was a woman. This is, and I know this, and we know this, Maggie, as soon as you enter into the public sphere and have an opinion on anything, as a woman, you are a target. There is a deeply sexist, violent undertone to how women are treated in public, which means that we can't have these discussions. We cannot have these discussions in a reasonable manner because they get hijacked.
And when a legislator is dominated by people of a gender to whom abortion isn't an automatic impact, i.e. men, you're never going to get an equal chance for women to have their say. If women were completely equal, if legislators were 50-50, then that might be different. But I think that's the concern, that when things start becoming back into the frame of law, it will be a parliament dominated by men who will make that decision. And that's where the issue of choice. It's also interesting, now I do want to move on, but it's come up in the social media chat around the equal protection from assault bill that's just been passed by the Scottish Government. So I've seen people say, this is tremendous that we're protecting children, what about children in the womb? And everybody I've seen that say that, I have to say, has been a man, but maybe I haven't been looking too widely. So it seems to be it's there all the time. It's like you can't disassociate it from any other right. When you talk about rights for any other group, people come back with this. And that it's completely different because, as Kirsten, I think, has eloquently explained, it's tied into violence against women. We're lucky. We're not the BBC. I'm the host. I can be impartial. No one's going to give me a rap over the knuckles. Might not be passed back on, but who knows. So we're going to move on. Have a quick look at a big international story. Two international stories. One, the news this week that North Korea has broken off its nuclear talks with the United States. Now, we've been here before. Is it sabre-rattling? Is it actually something to worry about? Interesting to note, Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, and when Clinton was standing down from his presidency, she had opened negotiations with North Korea that were going reasonably well. And they were desperate for a meeting with Clinton 2 weeks before he stood down. But in that intervening 3-month period, where traditionally the American president is allowed to take on any project he wants to do, George W. Bush was said to, you want to do North Korea, that's absolutely fine by me. And he weighed it up, and in the end he decided instead to take up talks around Israel and Palestine and not go to North Korea. And he said afterwards, that was a mistake because Arafat changed his mind. He lied, he didn't do what he was going to said he would. Interesting to think, had that happened then, we might not have been in this position. Now, who knows? North Korea is a rogue state. You can't really predict anything. But is this something we really need to be worried about over our cornflakes in the morning? Or is it just sabre-rattling? Is it trying to make Trump look like the big strong man? I'm conflicted on this.
I don't think we probably need to be worried about it over our cornflakes. I think probably people...
a nuclear attack on the United States is nothing for the world to be worried about.
I think probably South Korea and Japan will be worried about it over their cornflakes.
But they have ballistic missiles that can reach the States.
Yeah.
And they bomb
maybe. Japan
or South Korea, and we just sit back and go, well, that's
maybe. The thing with North Korea, I think, and I'm not any great expert, but it seems that their whole thing is just to constantly keep everyone guessing. They've continually for decades now kind of started to negotiate and then pulled back, and then started to negotiate and then pulled back, and then started to negotiate and then pulled back. And the whole thing, I think, is or a lot of it rather is for an internal audience. They're not really trying to make peace. They're trying to show how the Americans and the Chinese and the Japanese and the South are all out to get them and are all just, playing their own little power games.
So
and North Korea
is
just a pawn for them. And but it's not. I don't even think bad faith is the way to describe it. It seems to me that it's just using all the other countries that have an interest in peace for North Korea and normalization, I guess, of North Korea. The goal is to mess with those countries, because it makes North Korea more powerful if it can keep America dangling. It makes them look more important, more power. It makes the ruling family seem like they're big shots because they can make Donald Trump dance to their tune.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly powerful thing. And
but when you've got a rogue president, it's a slightly dangerous high-risk strategy.
It is a slightly dangerous one. And I grew up in the Cold War in Central Europe, and we all remember that, the air raid sirens, and we were going to hide under the desks when the missiles came over.
Yeah.
And that kind of threat is now kind of highly localised and is being used. That sort of Cold War threat of mutual assured destruction is being used in a highly localised area of Southeast Asian politics. And we have seen, I think I would agree with Kenny on this, is that the game playing that we've seen from the North Koreans has constantly been to say, well, we're the ones with the nuclear power here, you're going to come and basically reinforce our national status and our national pride in ourselves. I would say, given what I know about how dictatorships work, and particularly how North Korea works, it's not so much playing to the internal audience in a democratic way, but it's reinforcing the powerful image that kind of don't mess with us, because actually we could bring America down, so just think what we could do to you. It is that internal politics. But it's also strategically, I think you're right, it's playing with Japan and those kind of things. And I think any major Western power that got involved in North Korea and didn't know that was what the gameplay was would be incredibly naive.
But on the bright side, I suppose we were kind of here during the Cold War. It was negotiations between the Soviet Union and America, and in the end, that had a breakthrough. So let's keep fingers crossed. Let's also stay in the Far East just now, and I have been particularly alarmed at what has been unfolding in Japan since June, and things have really taken...
Japan?
In Hong Kong. I'm always worried about Japan. Things have escalated. Obviously, the Emergency Powers Act, an Emergency Powers Act was introduced this week on the banning of face masks, which seems a particularly sort of Far Eastern issue, because obviously we know that people do wear face masks in Hong Kong for other reasons other than trying to keep themselves off the TV cameras. Protesters are calling it an effectively martial law. 2 people have been shot now, a young man on the 1st of October who's in a serious condition, and we believe a 14-year-old boy yesterday, and a 12-year-old boy has been arrested. So they're now shooting at and arresting children. And we've been hearing for weeks that the Chinese police force and military are massing on the border, and one can't help feeling it could well turn extremely nasty.
We've heard even worse than that, which is that the Chinese government has engaged triads to act as paramilitaries to kind of have to battle back on the streets.
Okay.
I mean, it's a pretty horrifying situation in every respect. The whole idea of one country, 2 systems, I think, was always going to be very difficult.
It's a bit like here.
it's not China's way to have difference. It's why they crack down on Tibetan activists. It's why they crack down on the Muslim population.
They have one time zone across the whole of China.
Yeah, they have.
No matter where you are in China, it covers several time zones. It's the same time everywhere.
And China has such great racial homogeneity as well. Like, if you're not Han, if you're not Chinese, then you're not really Chinese. They have a very kind of clear sense of what being Chinese means. And Hong Kong is a problem for that, because they absolutely believe it's China, and everybody there, or most of the people there, look Chinese, but they don't think Chinese, and they don't act Chinese.
Especially people in Hong Kong.
And their economy doesn't work
because of the
like
autonomy.
Chinese.
And I think, obviously their initial demand that the extradition bill be dismissed has happened. But because of the crackdown and the violence, that's not enough now. So their demands are, one, that Carrie Lam goes, 2, that the word protest and riot is removed from the dialogue, and that there's a complete amnesty for anybody who's been arrested, and that there's also a full inquiry and consequences of the violence.
Yes.
And I think if that doesn't happen, I can't really see these protests ending from the protester side. I think how it will end will be there will be a further escalation of violence.
Yes.
And I think heaven forbid, if the police open fire again with live ammunition and someone dies, I really fear for what might happen. And I think it really has escalated in a way that we haven't seen in that part of the world, I guess, really since Tiananmen Square.
No, and we predicted it. It's interesting that the handover of power in Hong Kong, there was a huge concern about these two completely different legislative, political, historical systems being melded together in a way that was going to please, basically, the Chinese. I remember kind of when the independence referendum here was taking place, and I had Chinese journalists coming over, and also journalists coming from Eastern Europe, who were saying, why are there no tanks on the streets? This is a huge uprising, people marching, and there are no tanks on the streets. And the UK negotiated its handover of Hong Kong on the somewhat naive supposition that there would never be tanks on the streets in Hong Kong, that there would be a sort of quasi-British sense of democracy. You'd see demonstrations over climate change, you'd see demonstrations over all sorts of things that you see in a different elements of peaceable demonstration in the UK. And of course, that isn't the way the Chinese operate at all. And so the thing that is surprising to me is it's taken this long for this kind of demonstration to happen in Hong Kong. But the interesting thing you were saying there, Maggie, is about the consequences. Because it's not going to end particularly well for either side. But I do think the demonstrators are going to be on the short end.
Yes, but China doesn't care what the world thinks about them. I don't think they do.
They do. They absolutely do if it affects their economic progress. So they are incredibly canny about how they negotiate
so
that.
Much of the world is in hawk to China.
Exactly.
What are you going to do about it?
Which is why they will keep partners on side to a certain extent. And one of the things which will be really interesting, and we can be interested in this from our safe seats in Scotland, because we're not the ones being shot at, about this is the point you raised about the legislative consequences, whether this is going to be seen as illegal police brutality. There are already moves amongst the legislature in Scotland, in Hong Kong, to start bringing together the kind of legal challenges that would happen. And I think what will play out is that it will be found under the rule of law to have been completely lawful. And that is the gameplay that they think will happen, because that will, show the demonstrators that there is no point doing violent demonstrations, etc., but that they were acting, but this government was acting democratically, was acting in an accountable fashion, was being fair, open, legal, accountable, all the things that people were worried the Chinese wouldn't do. Actually, they were absolutely fair. Now, we've seen this happen in democracies all over the world, violent suppression of demonstrations. We've seen it within our own democracy. We sent the police in against the miners and all sorts of things. So we haven't got no moral high ground here to judge Hong Kong or China in this respect. But I think that, again, is going to possibly what is going to play out. It's going to be found to be actually entirely legal.
Okay, I'm going to bring it back to the UK as we get towards the end of the programme. I said at the top of the show that the greatest expectation this week was the vote of no confidence and the suggestion of a unity government. The SNP have been pushing for that to happen as soon as possible. The rest of them can't agree. Jo Swinson is trying to be kingmaker again by saying anybody but Jeremy Corbyn. Her MP from Caithness came out and said he'd rather have no deal than Jeremy Corbyn, which was mendacious, to say the very least. Given that there's going to be a Queen's speech soon, so there may yet be a legal prorogation of Parliament and a snap general election, when are they going to have the vote of no confidence? Are they going to have it? Are we going to get a caretaker government? And put you on the spot, who would you vote for to be that caretaker Prime Minister?
Oh, Lord.
Kirsten, you're having a wee thing.
At this point,
I'm having a
despite the
breakdown.
fact that I have a law degree, I would not be at all surprised if somebody went into the House of Commons and threw a dead badger onto the floor and said this means that the Speaker is now the Prime Minister, because all of these things have been an absolute, not a farce, but it's been a kind of scripted drama in terms of all of the prorogations and the Now, we know there is some very clear strategizing going on behind the scenes. We know there's some very clear power plays going. The Lib Dems have always been power brokers. That's exactly how they operate. That's exactly how they operated when they came into coalition, that they were going to be the power brokers. And those of us who were looking in policy terms of what they actually achieved in coalition realised that was essentially all they were. There was no Liberal Democrat proactive, grassroots policies that mitigated Tory austerity.
No,
so
none
that's
whatsoever.
none whatsoever. In fact, it supported Tory austerity incredibly, and that's an academic perspective. That's not a political perspective.
But it also happens to be
But
true.
in terms of
Well,
in terms of
interesting then,
how
so-
Joe Swinson is playing this
So
now.
Jill Swinson has said, if we get power, I will rip up Article 50. Now, the only way she's going to get a whiff of power would be to get back into coalition with the Conservatives. She's not going to
Exactly.
rip up Article 50 in that
Exactly,
case.
that's the game she's playing.
And she's already said, I wouldn't rule out working with the Conservatives, but I would rule out working with Boris Johnson. So she doesn't want to work with Boris Johnson. She doesn't want to work with Jeremy Corbyn. Who does she want to work with? So who would you vote if you were in the
Joe
House?
Swinson wants power.
Yes, but
That's-
I'd like a Porsche. Neither of these things are going to happen. Who would you vote for if you had a list? So a number of people in the frame: Harriet Harman, Margaret Beckett, the Speaker Bercow has been mentioned,
Bercow wouldn't
Ken
do it.
Clarke. 2 weeks ago on this show, we had this conversation, and I suggested that Ken Clarke might be someone they would approach his name was in the pot.
Yeah.
Who would you? Come on, I'm putting
Okay,
you on
I
the
vote
spot.
for Harriet Harman simply because she has a long history of being able to negotiate very difficult things within the Labour Party, and if anybody can survive that, then I think they stand a
Okay.
good chance of
Kenny?
being able to do it.
Honestly, I think I would be tempted to put one of the SNP in. I mean, obviously, it's never going to happen.
No, but that's your choice. Would it be Ian Blackford or
someone
somebody else?
someone like Joanna Cherry, who's been very, very much a leader on the kind of movement against Brexit. She's well respected. She's smart. She seems to get along with a lot of different people. I mean, we spoke to her a little bit on camera at the march. Also spoke to her a little bit off camera, and she did talk a little bit about the work that's going on behind the scenes. And I mean, I've a lot of time for Joanna Cherry. I think she would be an excellent person. And if in that situation, if part of the deal that could be conjured was that a Section 30 order would be passed, then it would be quite easy for her to say, all I'm doing is kind of managing a bunch of disparate groups that all have some overlapping aims, and then we're gone. You don't ever have to think about me again. That, I mean, nobody in England would support it.
No, we're in fantasy
So you
politics
heard it
now.
here
would
first,
you?
folks. Joanna
Nobody would
Cherry
be
for
able
the
to
Prime
accept
Minister.
it.
I think I'd
But-
go for Bercow, just because he's quite. I mean, there's a lot of things
The
about Bercow
amusement
that I
factor
don't
would be
like,
high.
and he is extremely patronising, and he's not been particularly kind to the SNP group. But I think he has shown his mettle in the last few weeks, and I would go for him. Given that I think constitutionally it is possible, or it would be possible, to bring someone from the House of Lords in as Prime Minister, therefore not an elected person, we could really push the boat out and suggest that Nicola does it, because, you know, she's already a First Minister of a country, she kind of knows the ropes. That would really set the cat amongst the pigeons. If that were to happen, people...
I think we'd get English independence before we got Scottish independence.
Yeah,
under
and
those
probably,
circumstances.
Our
probably she'd have to be
international-
put into the House of Lords.
Our
and that would never
international
happen.
reputation would rise stratospherically, though, if that happened.
Well, I think it has risen quite far on the strength of how she's presented herself as a stateswoman over the last 2
When I said
years.
our, I meant British
Oh,
international reputation.
I think
Sorry.
Britain's international reputation is down the toilet, frankly, and I can't see. I'm just back from a week in Italy, and when you've got Italians sort of questioning you and saying, "What is wrong with your government?" This is Italians asking you that. You have
I know,
things
I
have
know.
really fallen
When we
quite
look back
far.
to the Italians.
If Joanna Cherry were to be become Prime Minister, people across the country would be saying you couldn't make it up. And that's what I've decided to end the programme with today, a bit of lightheartedness. I find myself saying you couldn't make it up about 16 times a day. Is there anything that you've caught in the news this week of which you've said you couldn't make it up?
I mean, honestly, I come in here and I do the show on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and almost every show I say, how is this possible? How is this happening? I mean, almost everything that's happening in politics on both sides of the Atlantic right now is you couldn't make this up. I mean, quite honestly, if somebody had written a script and pitched it, you know, with everything that's happened in the last, say, 2 or 3 years, if they'd pitched that script 10, 15 years ago, you'd have said,
But they have. It's
Nobody's
called House
go-
of Cards.
Nobody's going to buy that.
But if you look at
Positive
some of
one.
the plot lines in House
And
of
a
Cards,
very quick positive
you know,
one. I would never have predicted that a 16-year-old autistic girl would have pulled together a millions-wide climate change operation amongst young people.
and yet look at the abuse she is getting
Absolutely.
from white middle-class men.
feels so
What is
threatened.
it about a 16-year-old girl that is so threatening to that group of people? It is unbelievable.
I wish I could tell you.
She's not pretty, she's not smiling at them, she's not pleading with them,
See, I
she's not
think-
playing the game.
I think she is. I think she's an incredibly engaging kid. I mean, and you know,
I think the problem is they know she's right and they can't actually
Yeah.
it's
attack her for not being right, so it's back to school, playground, and we'll just attack the person, which is what happens to women the whole time.
Yeah.
You don't have to be 16, you can be, in my case, 49, and it happens to
Okay,
you.
well, I found one that has nothing to do with what we talked about today. It actually made me guffaw out loud. A number of Colombian drug smugglers were transporting $1.2 billion $1.2 billion worth of cocaine. Wow. And their boat sank, and the only things that floated were the containers in which the cocaine were stored. So they made a life raft out of the containers and were rescued from it. And perhaps not surprisingly, they have been charged with narcotic running and narcotic production. That made me think you couldn't make it up. I said this week it was a week of expectations. Life is like that at the moment all the time. It really is difficult to know from one minute to another what else is going to happen. We've covered some of the big issues today. We haven't managed to cover quite everything. But thank you very much for being with me this morning. As usual, we say this every time. It costs money to make these programmes, and we would love you if you could to donate. A £5 each would be fantastic. We're looking for more people to sign up to the website. We are looking to develop more programmes around current affairs. One of the things on the agenda is a kind of question time format. And we have such good guests on every week. We would know that we could get enough people to make that really work. And also it would mean we could bring in people that we don't always agree with, which would be even livelier. I think we've had a lively discussion this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.